He was 42 and told, plainly, that he was too old for the saddle work that had fed him since he was a boy. No family waiting, no bank behind him, no plan past the next ridge, just a canvas bedroll, a tin coffee pot, and $311 folded in an oilcloth. And with that $311, he bought a ruined ranch nobody wanted in a place called Cold Creek. But what nobody in that valley knew was that behind the cracked stones of the main cabin's fireplace, sealed up for the better part of 40 years, was something that would undo the small, diminished life he thought had been handed to him. So settle in with us, and if you'd tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and tap that subscribe button before we ride any further, we'd count it a kindness. This one is worth staying for. Walter Weaver was born in a plank house on the edge of a cattle town, whose name is not the point of this story. The second of 4 children, and the only one who took to horses without being taught to. His father was a freighter who drank hard and died young of a chest complaint. The winter Walter turned 9, and his mother, worn to the bone by the birth of the last child, married a storekeeper within the year and moved her 3 younger down into the town, where there was a stove that stayed warm and a roof that did not leak. Walter, who at 9 already had the long-boned quiet of a grown man in the making, was sent up the valley to his mother's uncle, a widowed cattleman named Ansel Prewitt, who ran a small outfit of red and roan cows along a creek that froze solid every January and thawed loud every April. It was understood, without being said, that Walter would work for his keep, and he did. Ansel Prewitt was 61 that first winter, and had buried a wife and 2 grown sons, one to a fever and one to a horse that fell backward on him in the breaks. He was a man who spoke maybe 40 words a day and expected none of them repeated. He taught Walter how to sit a green horse without fighting it, how to read the wind for weather a full day before the weather came, how to shoe a mule that did not want to be shod, how to split cedar for fence posts so the grain ran with the wet and not against it, how to skin out a downed steer in the cold without ruining the hide, and how to keep a fire going in a wet camp with nothing but a pocket knife and patience. He taught him that a man's tools were the second half of his hands, and that leather, kept oiled, would outlive the man who oiled it. He never once told Walter he was proud of him, but on the morning of Walter's 15th birthday, Ansel laid down on the kitchen table a folding barlow knife with a bone handle worn brown by another man's thumb, and he said, "This was my father's, and now it is yours, and see you don't lose it." Walter did not lose it. He carried it every day of the 27 years that followed, in the right-hand pocket of whatever trousers he was wearing, and he sharpened it on a whetstone every Sunday evening, and by the time he was 42, the bone handle had a second thumb worn hollow next to the first, his own. Ansel died in his sleep the spring Walter was 19, and the little outfit went to a nephew in Missouri who sold the cows and the land inside of a season and did not answer Walter's letter asking after the dog. Walter took what wages were owed him and hired on with a bigger operation 2 ranges south, and after that, a bigger one still. And for the next 23 years, he worked cattle in high country from the first thaw to the last drive, wintered in bunkhouses that smelled of coal oil and wet wool, saved what he could, and lost most of it to the ordinary erosions of a working man's life. A horse that had to be put down, a doctor bill for a busted collarbone, a friend's widow who needed the loan more than he needed the money back. He never married. He courted a school teacher one autumn in a town he liked, and she chose a man with a house, and Walter did not blame her, and did not try again. He was known, up and down that country, as a hand who could break a colt without breaking its heart, who could be trusted with a tally book, who did not drink on the job and did not talk on the trail unless there was a thing needed saying. He was, in the ledger of the world, a good man and a diminishing asset, and he understood the second part before anyone had to tell him. But other men told him anyway. The foreman at the last outfit, a decent enough fellow named Hollis Meade, sat him down in the cook shack the September of his 42nd year and said, gentle as he could, that the owners were bringing in younger boys for the winter camps because the winter camps were killing older men, and that Walter's knee, which had gone out under him twice on the last drive, was a thing the outfit could not carry into another season. He would have work through the fall gather, and after that they wished him well. Hollis said all this looking at his coffee and not at Walter, and Walter thanked him for the years and for the honesty, and he went out to the corral and put his hand on the neck of the sorrel gelding he had ridden 4 seasons, and he stood there a long time before he went to pack his war bag. In the bottom of that war bag, wrapped in a square of oiled flannel, were the 2 things he would not have parted with for any price the world could offer: Ansel Prewitt's bone-handled Barlow knife and a small daguerreotype of his mother taken the year before she remarried, in which she was not yet tired and was almost smiling. The fall gather took 6 weeks, and Walter worked it the way he had worked every gather before it, which is to say, he rode out before light and came in after dark, and did not favor the bad knee where anyone could see. He gathered strays out of brush the younger boys would not push into, and he cut and held a herd on open ground with the sorrel while the others roped. And he tallied on the last day with a pencil stub in a canvas notebook and handed the numbers to Hollis Meade without comment. There was no supper laid on for him at the end, and he had not expected one. The bunkhouse cleared out early that night, the younger hands going to town on the promise of winter wages, and Walter sat on the edge of his cot in the yellow lantern light and rolled his blankets and set his war bag by the door. He counted his money on the wool blanket by feel and by lamplight, and it came to $311 folded into a square of oiled cloth, which was what a man had to show for 23 years of not drinking on the job. In the morning, Hollis Meade met him at the cook shack door with an envelope of the last owed wages and a handshake that lasted a beat longer than was easy for either of them. And Hollis said, "You'll land somewhere, Walter." And Walter said, "I expect I will." And that was all of it. There was no note on a door and no signed paper and no argument raised. There was only a man of 42 walking out to the corral in the gray light and putting his hand one last time on the neck of a sorrel gelding that was not his and had never been his, and the horse turned its head and lipped at his sleeve as it always did, and Walter walked away from the fence without looking back, because looking back was a habit he had trained out of himself a long time before. He borrowed no horse. He had been given the loan of a bay mare and a pack pony out of the remuda for as long as it took him to reach a town where he might buy his own, and this was as much charity as the outfit would extend and as much as he would take. He tied his war bag and bedroll behind the cantle and slung the tin coffee pot in a sack at the pack pony's side and rode out of the yard at a walk, past the cook shack where smoke was already going up, past the corral where the sorrel stood watching, and onto the wagon road that led down out of the high country toward the flats. No one came out to see him off. That was not cruelty. That was only the way of a working outfit at the tail end of a season, when every man had his own packing to do and his own road ahead. And Walter would not have wanted a farewell besides the one Hollis had given him at the door. He rode south and east for 11 days. The country came down in long steps out of the pine timber into sage flats, and then rose again into a lower range where the aspens had already gone yellow and were beginning to drop, and the wind at night carried the first hard edge of the coming winter, thin and clean and smelling of stone. He camped where there was water and grazed the 2 horses on what grass the season had left. And he cooked beans and bacon in a small iron skillet over fires he built with a pocket knife, and patience the way Ansel Prewitt had taught him 33 years before. He slept in his canvas bedroll with the Barlow knife under the folded coat that served as his pillow, and the daguerreotype wrapped inside his shirt against his chest. Not because he feared losing them, but because they were the shape of the life he was carrying. And a man carries the shape of his life close to him when the country is wide and the road is uncertain. His knee ached on the 3rd day, and on the 5th day, and by the 7th he had learned to favor it in the stirrup without thinking. And he told himself, as he rode, that a man could still work who could not sit a winter camp, and that a place of his own would ask different things of his body than a drive would. And he was not certain he believed it, but he thought it steadily, and he kept riding. In a town called Bowers Ford, he sold the bay mare back to a liveryman who was expecting her, and bought instead a plain buckskin gelding, 10 years old and honest, with a white sock on the off hind and a scar across the near shoulder where a wire had once caught him, for $42, including the trade of an old bridle he did not need. He kept the pack pony on the same terms he had ridden out under, meaning to send her back with a freighter when the chance came. He asked in Bowers Ford after ground for sale in the low valleys, and the storekeeper there, a thin man with ink on his cuffs, said there was a place up in Cold Creek that had been standing empty better than 15 years, and the tax on it had lapsed and lapsed again, and the county would let it go for what was owed, which last he had heard was under $300, and it was ruined ground, and the man who could make anything of it had not yet come by. Walter rode north into Cold Creek on the afternoon of the 12th day, and the valley opened before him the way a hand opens when it lets a bird go. Quiet and slow, the pines standing dark on the ridges to either side, and the creek itself running gray-green down the middle over pale stones, and a wind coming down out of the north end of it that already had winter in the throat. He saw the place from a half-mile out. The main cabin sat on a low bench above the creek with its back to the pines. Its ridge sagged in the middle where 2 roof poles had given, and beside it a plank shed leaned like a drunk against a corral whose top rails were down and whose posts were rotted at the ground. A water lot below the cabin was skimmed already with morning ice at the edges. There was no smoke, no track fresher than a deer's, no dog to bark at his coming. He sat the buckskin on the road above the place for a long moment, and he looked at it with the eye Ansel had trained in him, the eye that measured what was broken against what was sound. And he saw that the walls of the cabin were still square under their bad roof, and the chimney of creek stone at the north gable was still standing, and the pines behind it would give winter shelter to the north wind, and there was water within a short carry, and grass, brown now, that would come back in the spring. He said aloud, to the buckskin and to no one, "Well," and he touched the horse with his heel and rode down. He rode down to the place at a walk, and he did not dismount at once. He circled the cabin first on the buckskin, keeping the pack pony on a short lead, and he saw the door standing open half an inch on a leather hinge that had cracked and stiffened, and he saw a square window in the south wall with the oiled paper long since torn out, and a length of feed sack tacked over the hole from inside by some earlier passer-through. And he saw a stovepipe hole in the ridge near the north gable where a pipe had been drawn out and never replaced. The logs of the cabin were lodgepole pine, hewn on 2 sides, notched saddle and cope at the corners, and Walter counted them as he rode. 9 courses to the plate on the long walls, 8 on the gables, chinked once with clay and horsehair, and then again, later, with a poor mix that had fallen out in long tongues between the middle logs. The plank shed beside it was pine board on a pole frame, roofed with shakes gone gray and curled, and half the shakes on the windward pitch were gone altogether so that the rafters showed like ribs. The corral was cedar, and the down rails could be lifted and set again by one man with time. The water lot had been dug by hand out of the creek bench and lined with flat stones, and the stones were still there under the skin of ice, sound, and level. Walter got down slow, favoring the knee, and he looped the buckskin's reins on a corral post that would hold, and he walked the ground on foot. Inside the cabin the floor was puncheon, split log laid flat side up, and the boards had cupped where rain had come through the sag in the roof, and there was a drift of pine needles and mouse leavings in the corner opposite the door. There was a table of pine, one leg gone and replaced with a piece of stovewood, and a bedstead in the back corner strung with rotten rope, and a shelf above the bedstead, with a tin cup and a broken lamp chimney on it, and nothing else. The fireplace at the north gable was the piece of it that had been built to last. It was creek stone set in lime mortar, 6 feet across at the base and rising to a hood of the same stone before it stepped into the flue. And the hearth in front of it was 3 long slabs of the same creek stone, worn smooth in the middle by a foot that had stood there many years. The firebox was black, with old soot to the depth of a hand, and the back wall of it was cracked in a long jag from the lintel down to the floor of the box, as if the fire had once been built too hot against a cold stone. Walter squatted at the hearth on his good knee, and put his palm to the mortar and to the stone, and he felt where the mortar had gone chalky and where it still held, and he stood up slow and he said aloud, "This will do." He rode out that afternoon back down the wagon road to the county seat, which was a day and a half at a walk with the pack pony, and he slept one night by a fire under a cutbank and came into the courthouse at mid-morning of the second day. The clerk was a young man with a green eyeshade who looked at the ledger for a long time before he found the entry, and then he read the numbers off in a bored voice and said the back taxes on the Cold Creek quarter section stood at $287.40, and that the county would take it and be glad to be shut of it. Walter counted out $287.40 in bills and coin onto the wooden counter, and he signed the paper the clerk pushed at him, and he took the deed folded into thirds and put it inside his shirt against the daguerreotype. He had $23.60 left in the oiled cloth in his pocket when he walked out of the courthouse into the noon sun, and he was a man with a piece of ground for the first time in his life. He rode back to Cold Creek slow with the pack pony loaded from a general store with a bag of cornmeal, a slab of side pork, a paper of coffee, a pound of nails, a small cross-cut saw, a hand axe he did not need but bought anyway because the edge was true, and a tin of lamp oil. And he came onto the bench above the creek in a snow flurry that stopped as soon as it started and left the grass wet. He unloaded the pony, and he turned the 2 horses into the corral after mending the 2 down rails with a length of rope, and he carried his war bag and bedroll into the cabin and set them against the wall by the fireplace. He stood a moment in the door, and he looked at the room by the gray light coming through the paper-torn window, and he understood that before he could sleep in it he would have to have a fire, and before he could have a fire he would have to clean the hearth. He went at the firebox on his knees in the fading light, with a piece of shake for a scraper and a feed sack for the sweepings. He pulled out old ash by the double handful, and pieces of a nest that some small creature had built in the throat of the flue in a summer long past, and a fragment of iron that had once been the tang of a poker, and a curl of birch bark black at one edge and untouched at the other. When the box was cleaned to the stone, he set his shoulder against the crack in the back wall, and he pressed, not hard, only to feel, and the stone gave under his hand by the width of a knuckle, and gave no further. And Walter sat back on his heel, and he looked at the crack a long time. He fetched the Barlow knife out of his right-hand trouser pocket, and he opened it, and he ran the point of the blade along the crack from the top down to the hearth, and the mortar came away in a fine gray dust. And behind the mortar was not more mortar, but air. He worked at it then in the last of the daylight, and then by the yellow of a lantern he trimmed and lit and set on the hearth stones. He took the stones out one at a time, and he laid them on the puncheon floor in the order he took them, the way Ansel Prewitt had taught him to lay out the parts of a stripped-down bit so that a man could put a thing back the way he found it. There were 7 stones in the back wall of the firebox, and behind them was a second course of stone laid dry, not mortared, and behind the second course was a space, and in the space, cool and dry and smelling faintly of cedar, was a small room hollowed out of the thickness of the chimney and the log wall behind it. No bigger than the inside of a wardrobe, and no taller than a man sitting on his heel. Walter held the lantern into it. On the floor of the small room, which had been floored with cedar shakes laid flat, was a tin box the size of a family Bible, painted once green and now the color of old moss, and beside the tin box a folded quilt of small blue and brown squares, and on top of the quilt a wooden box no bigger than a hand, and on top of the wooden box a folded paper tied with a length of ordinary brown string. He did not reach in at once. He knelt with the lantern held out, and he looked at the arrangement of these things. The quilt folded corner to corner, the paper set square upon the wooden box, the wooden box set square upon the tin, and he saw that whoever had put them there had put them there with a mind toward another person coming, and had thought about how they would be found, and had wished it. He drew the paper out first, and he sat down on the hearthstones with his back against the warm-smelling brick of the outer chimney, and he untied the string with his fingers. The paper had been folded 3 times, and the folds had gone brown at the creases, but the ink inside was still black and legible, written in a careful hand that sloped a little to the right, and Walter read it slow, moving the lantern with his left hand to keep the light on the page. To whoever finds this, the letter began. My name is Hetty Ann Marlowe, and I lived in this cabin 22 years. My husband John Marlowe built it in the spring of the year we came into this valley, and he died in the second winter of a lung fever, and I stayed on. I kept a milk cow and a garden, and I took in sewing for the freighters, and later I was midwife to the women on this side of the divide from the year my husband died, until my hands would not do it anymore. We had one child, a boy named Thomas, who was born in this cabin and who died in it in his 4th year of a fever I could not turn, and he is buried under the biggest pine behind the house where the ground is soft in April. I am writing this in my 68th year, and I am going down to my sister in Kansas because I cannot cut wood any longer, and I will not be a burden on the neighbors here who have been kind. I am leaving this cabin to whoever comes and stays. I have hid it because the county will come and take it if they know, and I would rather it went to a person than to a paper. In the tin box is $142 in coin and bills, which I saved out of the sewing and the midwifery over many years, and which I meant for Thomas when he grew. And since he did not grow, I am leaving it for you. In the wooden box is a ring that was my mother's, and it is not worth much, but it is silver, and it is honest. The quilt I made in the winter of the year Thomas was 3, and he slept under it, and I could not take it with me, and I could not leave it out for the mice. If you are reading this, I hope you are tired, and I hope this is a good place to be tired in. The wind comes hard out of the north in January, and the chimney draws best when there is a good bed of coals under a green log. Be kind to the pine behind the house. Hetty Ann Marlowe, this 17th of October. Walter read the letter through once, and then again, and when he had read it the second time, He folded it along its old creases, and he set it on his knee, and he sat for a long while looking into the small room with the lantern held between his hands, and he did not move. Then he reached in, and he lifted out the tin box, and he set it on the hearthstones, and he opened it with the Barlow knife under the lid, and inside were bills folded flat under a stone, and coin wrapped in cloth twists like the ones a storekeeper makes. And the money was there just as she had said it was, $142, counted out on the hearth in the yellow light of the lantern beside a folded quilt of blue and brown squares, and a small wooden box holding a plain silver ring and a letter written 40 years before, by a woman who had lost a boy she never got to see grow up. Walter took his own Barlow knife out of his pocket, and he laid it on the hearth beside the ring. And he sat a long time, and he did not say anything at all. In the morning he did not begin with the fireplace. He laid the stones of the back wall back into their places one by one, in the order he had set them on the floor, and he mixed a small batch of lime mortar from a sack he had bought in Bower's Ford, and had carried up on the pack pony, and he buttered each stone as he set it. And he did not close the hidden room, but left a single stone loose at the bottom, so that a man could reach in with his arm if he ever needed to. And then he wiped the joints clean with the edge of his thumb, and stepped back and looked at his work by the gray light coming through the torn paper window. He carried the tin box and the wooden box and the folded quilt to the pine table, and set them there in a row. And he set the letter under the tin box so the wind would not take it. And then he went outside to the shed and began to count what he had. He had 1 pound of nails and a hand axe and a small cross-cut saw and a tin of lamp oil, and he had 2 horses and a corral he could mend in an afternoon and a roof he could not. And he had $23.60 in an oilcloth in his pocket, and $142 in a tin box on the pine table. And he had until the first hard snow to make the cabin fit to winter in. He set his work in order the way Ansel Prewitt had taught him to set a day's work in order, which was by what would kill you first if you did not do it. And roof came first, and chinking second, and stovepipe third, and the shed and the corral after that, and the water lot last, because the ice at its edges only meant the creek was working the way a creek works. He rode down to a place called Pardee's Mill on the second morning with the pack pony and $11 in his pocket, and he came back 3 days later with the pack pony loaded with fresh shakes split from straight-grained cedar, and a bundle of ridge poles, and a coil of number 9 wire, and a bag of clay for chinking, and a stovepipe in 3 joints wrapped in feed sack against the road. The man who ran the mill was named Orrin Pardee, 63 years old, a widower who had lost 2 fingers of his left hand to a saw 30 years before, and who ran the yard now with a nephew and a mule. And Orrin Pardee took Walter's money and threw in the ridge poles for nothing, and said only that he had known the woman who lived at the Cold Creek place a long time ago, and that she had midwifed his oldest boy in a bad winter and would take no pay for it. He did not say more than that, and Walter did not ask. Walter took the sagged roof off first. He climbed with a rope tied to his waist and the Barlow knife in his teeth, and he pried the old shakes free in courses, and dropped them in a pile below, and stripped the roof down to the 2 broken poles at the ridge. And he cut those out with the cross-cut saw, working alone from a plank laid across the plate logs, and he set the new ridge poles in their notches and drove them home with a wooden maul he made in an hour from a section of green aspen. He laid the shakes from the eaves up, 4.5 inches to the weather, 2 nails to a shake, driven into the ridge poles and the purlins below. And he did the windward pitch first, because the wind had already told him which side the weather came from. He worked from first light to last, favoring his knee on the ladder and taking the ladder slow. On the 4th day of that work, his shadow was joined by another shadow, and he looked down and there was a boy of about 14 standing in the yard, holding a covered pot in a folded cloth. And behind the boy sat a wagon and a woman on the wagon's bench with the reins loose in her hands. The woman was Merritt Doss, 39 years old, a widow who ran 20 head of milk cows on a place 2 miles down the creek, and who had heard from Orrin Pardai's nephew that a man was fixing the Marlowe cabin, and the boy was her son Judd, and the pot held a stew of beef and potatoes and wild onion under a lid tied down with twine. Merritt Doss did not get down from the wagon. She said, "We brought supper," and Walter said, "Much obliged," and Judd carried the pot inside and set it on the pine table beside the tin box. And then Judd went back out to the wagon and lifted down a small crock of buttermilk and a paper of salt. And Merritt Doss said, "The pot comes back when it comes back," and turned the team and drove down the wagon road without saying more. Walter watched them go, and he ate the stew that night at the pine table by lantern light, with the letter still folded under the tin box, and he slept that night on the puncheon floor in his canvas bedroll with the roof tight over his head for the first time in 15 years of that cabin's life. Others came the way the first ones had come, one at a time, without ceremony and without staying long. A man named Alderley Fenn, 51, a freighter working the road between Bowers Ford and the county seat, stopped a wagon at the corral on his way through and unloaded a barrel of good chinking clay he said was excess weight and would not take a coin for it, and said Hetty Ann Marlowe had sat up 2 nights with his wife in the year of the diphtheria, and there was a balance in his ledger he had never been able to close. A woman named Josie Rennick, 67, who lived alone in a soddy above the North Fork and kept 12 laying hens, sent down a dozen eggs in a basket with a boy she had hired for the day, and a note written in pencil that said only, "Welcome to the Valley." A quiet man named Bertram Olt, 48, a farrier who traveled the low ranches shoeing what needed shoeing, came up the road one afternoon with his box of tools on a mule and looked at the buckskin's feet and reset 2 shoes for the price of a plate of beans and a cup of coffee. And he stayed an hour after and helped Walter set the last shakes on the leeward pitch of the roof. And when he left, he said, "I'll come back in the spring and look at that off hind." And Walter said, "I'd take it kindly." Walter chinked the walls in the cold weeks of November working from a scaffold of 2 planks on trestles, and he mixed the clay from Alderley Fenn's barrel with wet sawdust and a little chopped grass in a bucket, and he pressed it into the gaps between the middle logs with the flat of a putty knife, made from a piece of tin, and he ran his thumb along each joint to bevel it so the water would shed. He set the stovepipe in 3 joints through the hole in the ridge and flashed it with a square of tin cut from a lard can and bedded in tar. He warmed on a fire outside, and he mounted a small sheet iron stove he had bought second-hand in the county seat for $4, and traded the broken lamp chimney and the tin cup back to the storekeeper for a length of stove wire. He mended the bedstead with a section of green rawhide cut from a hide Merritt Doss's boy Judd carried up on a Saturday for the trouble of hauling it, and he strung it with new rope from the general store, and he laid the quilt of blue and brown squares folded in 3 across the foot of the bed, and did not sleep under it, because it did not seem to be his to sleep under yet. But he could not put it back in the hidden room either. By the first week of December, there was smoke coming from the stovepipe at the north gable of the Cold Creek cabin every morning before light and every evening after dark, and the neighbors on the North Fork could see it from their doors, and they began to speak of the place by his name rather than by hers, and they said, "Weaver's place," when they meant the bench above the creek where the pines stood behind the cabin and the water lot lay below. Walter did not know that they had begun to say it until Judd Doss let it slip one afternoon, delivering a small crock of butter his mother had sent. and Walter did not answer to it out loud. But he took the correction inside himself and set it down carefully, the way a man sets down a good tool. He fell into the shape of a week without meaning to. On Monday, he cut wood, and on Tuesday, he split it and stacked it under the eaves of the shed in ricks 4 feet high, with the split faces down against the weather. On Wednesday, he rode the fence line of the quarter section, on the buckskin, with the pack pony carrying wire and staples, and he mended what the deer and the winters had broken, and he came back at dusk, with his knee bad and his hands cold, and a fire already laid in the sheet-iron stove waiting for a match. On Thursday, he worked at the corral, resetting the rotted cedar posts one at a time with a bar and a maul and a bucket of creek gravel tamped around each post. And he doubled the top rail on the wind side with a length of pine he had traded a day's labor for at Pardee's mill. On Friday, he rode down to Merritt Doss's place and worked a half day at whatever wanted doing there. And she paid him in milk and butter and once in a pair of wool socks knitted by Josie Rennick that had come to her by way of a boy hired for a day. On Saturday, he sharpened the tools on the whetstone Ansel Prewitt had given him with the Barlow knife 33 years before, and he oiled the leather of his bridle and his belt with neat's foot oil warmed on the stove. And on Sunday evening after supper, he sharpened the Barlow knife itself and wiped it with a bit of oiled flannel and put it back in his right-hand trouser pocket, as he had done every Sunday evening for 27 years. The valley settled around him without saying so. Alderley Fenn stopped his wagon at the corral on his through trips and shared a cup of coffee at the pine table and once brought a newspaper 2 weeks old that Walter read cover to cover by lantern light. Bertram Ault came back in January when the ground was hard as iron and looked at the buckskins off-hind as promised, and would not take money for the visit, but sat an hour at the stove and told a story about a mule he had known in New Mexico, and left. Orrin Pardee sent word by his nephew that there was a stack of scrap lumber at the mill Walter could have for the hauling, and Walter hauled it in 2 trips and used it to floor the shed and to make a proper door for the cabin. Hung on iron strap hinges, Orrin Pardee threw in with the lumber, and the door swung true on the first try and closed against the jamb with a soft, tight sound Walter stood and listened to for a minute before he went back to work. Josie Rennick sent eggs down every 3rd week by whatever boy she had hired that day, and Walter sent back a jar of the wild plum preserves he had put up in October from the trees along the creek, and this became a small traffic between them that did not require either of them to speak. He rode into the county seat once more in February, on a clear, cold day with the buckskin's breath white in front of him, and he stopped at the courthouse and asked the same young clerk in the green eyeshade to record a small change on the deed, and he had the clerk write in above his own name on the paper the words, "The Marlowe Place," so called. And the clerk wrote it in ink without comment, and stamped it and gave the deed back folded in thirds. And Walter put the deed inside his shirt against the daguerreotype and rode home. He hung the letter over the pine table on a nail he had driven for that purpose, folded but not sealed, so that anyone who came into the cabin and asked what it was could be told. Most who came did not ask. Merritt Doss saw it on her first visit inside the cabin, which was not until March, when she came up on foot to bring a setting of eggs for a hen Walter had traded for, and she stood before it a long moment and read it without touching it. And when she was finished, she said, "She was a good woman," and Walter said, "I believe she was." And Merritt Doss went out and got in her wagon and drove down the road, and that was all that was said about it between them for the rest of the winter. In April, the creek at the bottom of the water lot broke free of its ice in a single afternoon, and the sound of it carried up to the bench where the cabin stood, and Walter Weaver, who was 42 years old and had been told the winter before that he was too old for the high country. walked down through the wet grass in his scuffed boots, and stood at the edge of the water, and listened. The buckskin gelding was in the corral behind him with the pack pony, and the pines behind the cabin were dropping the last of their snow in soft, uneven falls, and the ridge of the roof he had rebuilt in October ran straight and true against the sky. He had not thought, in the cook shack with Hollis Meade looking at his coffee, that he would ever again stand on his own ground and listen to his own water come loose. He had not thought there would be ground of his to stand on. He stood there a while, and then went back up to the cabin because there was work waiting inside it, and there was always work waiting inside it, and he had come to prefer it that way. He came in through the door on its iron strap hinges, the door that swung true and closed tight, and he crossed the puncheon floor to the pine table where the letter hung on its nail above the tin box. He sat down in the chair he had made in February from mill scrap and rawhide, and he took the Barlow knife with the bone handle out of his right-hand trouser pocket and laid it on the table beside the small wooden box that held Hetty Ann Marlowe's mother's silver ring. He had done this on Sunday evenings through the winter, after he had sharpened the knife on the whetstone Ansel Prewitt had given him with it 33 years before, and he did it now without ceremony. The two objects lay on the pine boards, a hand's width apart in the lantern light. One had been carried out of a plank house on the edge of a cattle town by a man who had been dead when Walter was 9, and passed from that man's brother to a widowed cattleman on a small outfit up the valley, and put down on a kitchen table on a boy's 15th birthday, and carried in a right-hand pocket for 27 years across ranges Walter could no longer name in order. The other had been kept in a small wooden box in a hidden room behind a fireplace by a woman Walter had never seen, saved out of sewing money and midwifing money in a valley she did not leave, meant for a boy named Thomas who had died in his 4th year and was buried under the biggest pine behind the house. They were objects from two people who had loved children they did not get to see grow, and they lay on the table together. And Walter did not need to say what that was. He thought, sitting there, of the ones who had let him go. He thought of Hollis Meade, who had been honest with him and had not been cruel, and who had said he would land somewhere, and had been right in a way he could not have known. He thought of his mother, whom he had seen 4 times since he was 9, and who was in the daguerreotype folded inside his shirt against the deed, not yet tired, almost smiling. And of the nephew in Missouri who had sold Ansel Prewitt's cows and land within a season, and had not answered a letter about a dog. He thought of the schoolteacher who had chosen a man with a house, and he found he could think of her now without the small tightening that had followed him for years, because he had a house himself, and it was warm, and the smoke from its stovepipe rose above the north gable every morning before light. None of them had been wrong about him in the way they had thought they were right. He had been too old for the winter camps. He had been without family and without a bank behind him. He had been a man with $311 folded in a square of oiled cloth and a bad knee and a Barlow knife in his pocket, and every one of them had counted him accurately by the measures they used. They had only failed to see what Ansel Prewitt had trained him to see, which was that a thing other people had walked away from could still be square under a bad roof, could still have water within a short carry, could still have grass, brown now, that would come back in spring. He put the knife back in his pocket, and the ring back in the wooden box, and the wooden box back on the pine table beside the tin box. Outside, the buckskin knocked a rail with his shoulder, and the pack pony answered him. Walter heard, further down the road, the sound of a wagon he knew to be Merritt Doss's, coming up with Judd on the seat beside her to bring back the stew pot that had come back and gone out and come back again through the winter, and he heard it turn onto the track that led up to the bench, and he stood up from the table and went to open the door for them. Walter Weaver was 42, and he had been told he was too old to keep taking saddle work in the high country. And he had no family waiting, and no bank behind him, and no plan past the next ridge. He had a canvas bedroll and a tin coffee pot, and a folding Barlow knife with a bone handle worn brown by another man's thumb. And he had $311 folded in a square of oiled cloth. He spent $287 of it on the back taxes of a ruined ranch in Cold Creek that nobody wanted, and it was the best $287 he ever spent, and the $311 with it, and the $2360 that was left over in his pocket when he walked out of the courthouse at noon and rode north into a valley that would learn his name. If this story sat with you, take a moment to subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And before you go, think on this. What is the thing in your own life that other people have walked away from, that you might yet look at with a trained eye and find still square under a bad roof? Tell us in the comments, and let us know where you are watching from tonight.